All right, hello, I'm Kara. I'm the Guam 2020 to 2022 Coral Fellow, and I've been working on collecting information on our seagrasses and mangroves in Guam. It's part of a 2-year fellowship program supported by NOAA Southeastern University, the Department of the Interior, the All Islands Committee, and based out of the Guam Department of Agriculture. So thanks for listening. This is not the original webinar. Unfortunately, that was not able to be recorded. So this is just a recording for you to reference in case you missed it or want to share it with your friends. There won't be any questions at the end since there's no audience, but if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. I'm more than happy to help answer them. So let's get started. So we have a lot to cover, some basic information about seagrasses, then a little bit more about what could be threatening our seagrasses and how their cover has changed over time and what we can do to conserve and manage them. So starting off with the biology and ecology, what are seagrasses? Seagrasses are different from seaweeds or macroalgae because they are evolved from land plants. So they actually have vascular tissue like land plants, which basically means they have tubes through the leaves and into the bottom of the plant that help move nutrients and water around. They also have real roots that help them absorb nutrients. This is different from macroalgae or seaweed because they don't actually have tubes moving things around. They just are like absorbing, diffusing nutrients into their bodies, and then the holdfast just keeps that macroalgae in place. So seagrass, if you've ever like broken open a piece of celery and seen like the little tubes, seagrass has those little tubes. They also have rhizome, which is like a horizontal underground stem, and they can grow along the rhizome and spread out horizontally, increasing their cover, and they're basically making just copies of themselves when they do this. So that would be asexual reproduction. We also have sexual reproduction, where seagrasses have flowers and they undergo pollination and create a fruit. So we'll go over the seagrass flowers in a bit. We have 3 different species of seagrass in Guam. Inhalis acroides is the most common, and it's the largest. And then Halodule uninervis or Halodule, sorry, uninervis. And then Halophila minor, which was actually changed to Halophila gaudichaudi. Don't quote me on the pronunciation for that, that change. That was a relatively recent change. This species is more common in Micronesia compared to Halophila minor, which might be in some other areas of the Indo-Pacific. And that change was made by Dr. Roy Tsuda. So these 3 different species have different life strategies. Inhalis acroides is very large. The seagrass blades can grow up to like 1 meter. They have big roots as well, and they can also store a lot of nutrients in those roots, and that helps them resist any disturbance like a hurricane or any other stressful environmental conditions. So their strategy is to just hunker down and wait it out. For our other 2 smaller species, those actually don't really resist change as much as they bounce back. They grow faster, they're smaller, so if something happens like a storm, they can just regrow. Looking at some of their flowers, Inhalis has some pretty amazing looking flowers. Here you can see the male flowers. They're pretty small. You can see them on this person's hand, and they float around, sometimes making little rafts like this. And they come into contact with a female flower. So that's what that would look like from the surface and from the side. And then pollination occurs and the fruit will start to develop. This coiled peduncle withdraws it down into the water and it matures. Eventually it'll separate and start floating for a couple days, about a week or so, and then break up. The seeds might tumble around for a few days or float for a few days. Animals might also bring them into their burrows like gobies or shrimps, and that can help the seagrass reproduce sexually. And this is actually a pretty important method of growth for Inhalis acroides. It also means that this species is limited to pretty shallow areas because it relies on this surface pollination mechanism. And fun fact, these seeds are actually edible. They supposedly taste like chestnuts, although I haven't been able to try one. And they've been investigated as a source of additional nutrition. They have like good fiber and protein and iron, so pretty cool. Our Haloduli uninervis is very different. It has much smaller reproductive organs. So instead of those big flowers, we have this little tiny thing that barely looks like a flower at all. It's really just the stamen, the male organ that releases pollen. Couldn't find a picture of a female flower, but very minimal and small. It makes these small seeds as well. They're round, they're smooth, they're very good at tumbling. You can see them in between these, in this crevices in the sand, and they can accumulate. They use this mechanism called geocarpy, which helps them bounce back. Like I said, the seeds can remain dormant in the sand. Geocarpy, sorry, means the seeds are deposited into the sand basically. And they can remain dormant there for over 3 years. At least that's been the experimental conditions shown in the lab. So that helps them bounce back. There's a big difference in the concentration though. Some areas you'll have just 5 seeds. Some you'll have a huge seed bank of thousands of seeds. So something to investigate for us in Guam. And then for Halophila, I couldn't find a picture of our particular species, but it's similar to other Halophila species. Very minimal spindly flower. It makes this little fruit at the bottom, looks kind of like an onion bulb, and then releases these very tiny seeds. And that they do a similar mechanism to Haloduli that we just talked about. And then for Guam seagrass community, there's lots of things besides seagrass living in the seagrass. We have rabbitfish, which are very common. Both the young rabbitfish might shelter there and the old rabbitfish might forage there. They might eat some of these seagrass leaves. And then we have bivalves, filter feeders that might attach to the blades or live under in the sediments. Seagrass, sea hare, we have lots of little tiny things crawling on the seagrass. And then we have things living in the sediment or on it, like the sea cucumbers. They're important for aerating, adding oxygen into the seagrass sediments, and then larger things, maybe like a sea turtle as well. And then a lot of the life really is super tiny. So if you're to look closely at a seagrass blade, you could find polychaeta nematode worms, copepods, which are like a tiny type of crustacean or relative of a crab, little microscopic plants like diatoms and foraminiferans. So those are all that's just a sampling of the diversity that can live on the surface of a seagrass blade. So epi means surface, phyte means plant, although in this case it also applies to attached animals like anemones or bryozoans. And these are really important. We'll talk about them more. They can be helpful for feeding other fish and other organisms and supporting the food web, or they can also potentially cover up the seagrass blade and harm it. So why do we care about seagrasses? What kind of ecosystem services do they provide? Meaning, how do they benefit humans in any way? So seagrasses support our coastal communities, and they support the coral reefs. They act as nursery and fish habitats where little fish can grow before they head out to the coral reef. They sequester carbon and help improve water quality, and they reduce wave energy as well. And that can help prevent coastal erosion. So this is a conceptual diagram of how a seagrass might act as a nursery. Here we have the adult fish out in the ocean and in the coral reef. They make eggs, they spawn, they create little baby fish larvae, and those come inshore towards the mangroves and seagrasses where they find shelter. And eventually, when they're large enough, they move back out. So a lot of things are going to affect how useful of a nursery habitat it is. And Halus is a particularly good nursery habitat because the leaves are so broad, they offer a lot of structure. But other things might affect as well, like food. How is it really patchy? Is it well connected? How much distance is there between the seagrass and the other habitats they eventually need to get to or need to go to forage? excuse me. Does the tide come in a lot? If the tide goes up really high, then predators can come in. So there's a lot of things that are going to affect whether seagrasses are able to provide shelter for our smaller fish. We do know a few, it's well documented for certain species like the thumbprint emperor was seen to utilize seagrass heavily as a juvenile. So most of the thumbprint emperors in a particular study done as a master's thesis by Brent Taylor showed that this particular fish was mostly found, 82% of them were found in heavily dense seagrass areas. And most of those fish were very, very small, about less than 10 centimeters. So they're really utilizing the structure there. Juvenile rabbitfish, also very common to see swimming around in our seagrasses. And then the marbled or seagrass parrotfish, that also can be found in our seagrasses of varying sizes and also eat the seagrasses. So not only shelter in them, but actually actively eat them. And all of these are harvested. The marbled or seagrass parrotfish was harvested traditionally by women as well. So seagrass and mangrove ecosystems, how do they provide food? I mentioned that parrotfish eats the seagrass directly, but that's actually not that common. Parrotfish and rabbitfish might eat the seagrass directly, but many things actually use seagrass detritus. So detritus is basically decaying, rotting material. The seagrass blade breaks off, and fungi and microbes and all sorts of things start to break it down until it's a little bit more edible and potentially more nutritious. So here the seagrass is breaking down, and then this little amphipod, it's like a little shrimp-like organism, might eat that and then get eaten by fish and then something larger. So we actually are learning more nowadays that seagrasses do contribute a pretty good amount of, a pretty good portion to a lot of organisms' diet. Previously, it was thought that they wasn't that important of a function for many things. It's hard to tell when you're limited by techniques like looking at the gut contents or just observing as a snorkeler or with cameras to see what bites the seagrass. But now with isotopes, we can better understand, specifically carbon isotopes, we can better understand what things are eating and track what they've eaten back to the primary source of energy, whether that was the seagrass, the mangroves, upland terrestrial plants. We can track that primary producer's carbon as it moves through the food chain. And using these techniques, we found in at least one study where they looked at the community in the area, the biological community, that 10% of the organisms obtained 50% of their carbon that makes up their body from seagrasses. And the remaining 90%, about half of those had seagrass carbon at some point. So maybe they ate it when they were younger, or maybe as a larger fish, they ate something smaller that smaller thing ate seagrass. So it entered the food chain at some point and was included in that other about 45% of the organisms. So it's a pretty amazing contribution that seagrasses have to our coastal food webs. Here's another way we can look at this. Here's our seagrass. Once again, we have some direct grazing, sea turtles maybe, rabbitfish, sea urchins maybe. And then we also have the seagrass breaking apart, becoming detritus. That can become dissolved organic matter or particulate organic matter, where it can then feed little tiny things in the water like plankton, or the epiphytes growing on the seagrass surface, like all those little plants and sponges and anemones, or as particles especially, it can get buried. Epiphytes are actually super important. They might contribute even more to the food chain in certain cases than the seagrasses or the seagrass detritus itself. Another study found that rabbitfish got more calories and more nutrition from eating seagrasses that had epiphytes as opposed to seagrasses that had less epiphytes. In terms of burial, we have some of the seagrass contributing to its own sediments, but we also have a lot of input from other systems. Potentially, 20 to 50% or even more. Different studies will get different numbers. Different systems have different water flow, right? So potentially a large amount of the sediment buried in the seagrass bed comes from other sources, from terrestrial land, from the nearby mangroves, from macroalgae. So they're really good at calming the water with their blades and then settling out particles that can accrete over time. And then there's also export of the seagrass production to other ecosystems. They have found seagrass blades on the bottom of the deep ocean, and big predators even like a barracuda will have signs of seagrass production in their carbon as well. And they might swim off to like the coral reef, right? So that takes energy from the seagrasses into a different ecosystem. And seagrasses sequester a lot of carbon, so it looks like a little bit less than what you might find in some other estuary plants. Mangroves are, superstars here, but it looks like seagrasses are even less than the tropical forest, although if you look at it, much of that is stored below ground as opposed to above ground biomass. And that's really important because the below ground storage stores it for much, much longer, over a longer time span than the living biomass, which can fall, like leaves will fall down and decay, right? So even though seagrasses only make up about 0.2% of the ocean floor, very, very small, they store upwards of 10% of the carbon captured by the ocean. So pretty amazing. And then seagrasses also help buffer land-based sources of pollution. So they do that, one, by calming the water and letting particles settle down. And then two, they also directly adhere particles. All these epiphytes and stuff living on the seagrass produce mucus, and about 5% of particles might just stick to the seagrass directly. Here you can see epiphytes in this white. So that's normal. That's not unhealthy, like dying seagrass. That's just stuff growing on it. And you don't see sediment as clearly sticking to it, but you can see these microplastics. So here's a plastic fiber, a plastic microbead. It looks like some kind of fragment. So showing, unfortunately, plastic pollution, right? But showing that the seagrasses are really good at collecting particles. Seagrasses might also even help increase the pH and locally help reduce the impacts of ocean acidification for our corals. If the seagrasses are healthy themselves and net autotrophic, they can increase pH by about 0.38 potentially. And then they also do other things, like they can even reduce the amount of bacteria in the water, which can help lower coral disease. So lots of ways that they help improve water quality. All right, so our seagrasses are super important. They're home to lots of animals. What are some of the threats affecting our seagrasses? It's a pretty common worldwide trend that we have these long-lived, large seagrasses. This one is a species you might find in the Mediterranean that transition into these shorter-lived, fast-growing seagrasses and eventually into like algae and anoxic mud. And you can see this is not going to provide the same kind of ecosystem services as this ecosystem, right? There's not as much complex 3D structure for things to hide in as a nursery habitat. It's not going to attenuate the wave energy necessarily the same or store the carbon. So this is very troubling, and it's happening in many places. So why is this happening? Part of it could just be natural stressors that is exacerbated by climate change. So seagrasses live in a really stressful environment. They're in really shallow water that gets really hot. The UV radiation from the sun is strong. The tide can go down and they can get left out and they can desiccate and dry out. So there's a lot of causes of stress that could change the seagrass cover. Here you can see some bleached seagrass after it was in super hot temperatures of 43 degrees Celsius. And as climate change occurs, these hot weather events might happen even more frequently over time, which is very concerning. If similar to corals, how they can recover from bleaching, but they really can't recover if they just keep getting knocked down too frequently. Seagrasses also will have to we'll have to see if they can bounce back after these more frequent extreme weather events. Nutrient input could affect the species composition of our seagrasses. So this is based on seagrasses in Florida, but basically as you increase nutrient supply, little things like living in the water like microalgae, plankton, and macroalgae like seaweeds, those are going to absorb nutrients. They're really good at absorbing nutrients really quickly. They're more competitive when there's greater nutrient supply, and our slow growing long-lived seagrasses just aren't as competitive in that environment, and they'll be less represented when you have a high nutrient regime. And these are kind of in between our long-lived, slow-growing seagrasses and our super fast-growing things. Another way that nutrient pollution can affect our seagrasses is through exacerbating sulfide intrusion or poisoning of the seagrasses. So what's happening here is the seagrasses are living in anoxic sediments, meaning sediment without oxygen. When you have a lot of bacteria in the sediment and they have a lot of food in the form of like decaying organic matter, so decaying seagrasses or stuff coming from the land, and they have a lot of nutrients to use, then they do a lot of respiration. They do a lot of metabolism. They're breaking down their food, and they use up all the oxygen. And then they go to less efficient chemical ways to process their food. They use other elements, and they use up all these things until they finally reach sulfate reduction, and they start using sulfate to help process their food. And in that chemical process, in that metabolism, they create hydrogen sulfide. And that's that stinky smell you might have smelled if you've ever been in the mangroves or the salt marsh or in waterlogged sediments. It smells like rotten eggs. This hydrogen sulfide is toxic to not just seagrasses, but plants in general. It can impact their photosynthesis. And then if you go even further, they might do methanogenesis, and that will create methane, which is really bad because that's a really potent greenhouse gas, more potent than carbon dioxide. So these anoxic sediments are pretty stressful, but seagrasses have evolved to live in these sediments. And what they do is they have a process where they release oxygen out. It's called radial oxygen loss. As they photosynthesize and they create oxygen, they bring that down to the roots and they release some of that oxygen, and that creates like a little buffer zone, a little halo where there isn't as much hydrogen sulfide and the sediment isn't as anoxic. Inside, if you were to look at cross-section, if you cut that seagrass, you could find lots of parenchyma tissue, and those are like really, really spongy tissue that helps that oxygen flow. So seagrasses normally have to survive in this anoxic environment, and they've evolved to do so, but it is possible for them to get too stressed. So in this diagram, here you have healthy seagrass, normal photosynthesis, producing oxygen, releasing it into the sediment, preventing the hydrogen sulfide from forming, protecting the roots bring up nutrients, and then that helps support photosynthesis. So we have a healthy cycle going on here. And healthy seagrasses also support these leucinid clams, and inside these clams they have certain types of bacteria that also help reduce the amount of hydrogen sulfide. So that's another additional benefit. But if you have unhealthy seagrass and they can't support those clams and they're not photosynthesizing well, they're not producing a lot of oxygen and releasing oxygen, then the hydrogen sulfide can get into their roots or even higher up the plant, cause the roots to die off, and then the plants aren't getting the nutrients they need, which makes their photosynthesis even worse, and etc. So this is a feedback loop that is not beneficial for the seagrass, right? It's a cycle of death, basically getting worse and worse. Another additional stressor on top of that is that hydrogen sulfide will bind with iron in the sediment to form pyrite, also known as fool's gold. And then once it forms that, it's hard for the seagrass to take it up, and it's not likely to reverse necessarily. So then the seagrass might be iron limited as well, which is necessary for photosynthesis. And anything that impacts photosynthesis can put the seagrass at greater risk of sulfide intrusion. It usually is at night when seagrasses are at the greatest risk and greatest level of stress because they're not able to get sunlight to do photosynthesis and create that oxygen. But anything that limits their photosynthesis, like here we have epiphyte cover, some brown stuff growing on the seagrass. This is like not that intense of an amount, but if you have a lot of nutrient input, so here is the seagrass next to an aquaculture effluent pond, so there's a lot of fish waste coming out, and it's really, really covered, right? So they're not going to be getting a lot of sunlight in this case. The water is also really turbid, so that's also going to limit the amount of light and limit their ability to photosynthesize. So this is what we might consider a bottom-up control, from the bottom up nutrients into the seagrass or nutrients around the seagrass that are causing the epiphyte growth. But there's other things that control epiphyte growth as well, top-down controls, so not just the nutrients feeding the epiphytes, but things acting on the epiphytes higher up in the food chain. In this example, we have a top predator. This is not a tropical example, by the way. We have a top predator eating these crabs, so that means more of these guys, less crabs, more of these tiny grazers, which means they're eating more of these algal epiphytes, so there's less of these, and then that means there's less cover of these epiphytes on the seagrass, which means they can do a little bit better and photosynthesize a little better. So it's a pretty amazing. This top predator has an indirect positive effect on these seagrasses and can actually help this system overall be a little bit more resilient to nutrient pollution. So there's a lot of contributors to seagrass health. We've talked about a bunch of these already. We want good water quality, not too turbid, not too much nutrient input. We want a stable climate, not a lot of storms, not a lot of extreme heat events. We want healthy ecosystem with lots of organisms that can help make sure the epiphyte balance is correct. Special species, like functionally important species like sea cucumbers, they help aerate the sediment to reduce the amount of sulfide toxicity. And then the seagrass itself can potentially be more or less resilient. If there's greater genetic diversity, that will help them grow and reproduce better and survive better. We don't have that much research on this. There was a master's thesis done under Dr. Kiho Kim, where they looked at the connectivity of seagrasses in Micronesia, but unfortunately, they weren't able to look at that many sites or loci, and they might have had some issues with their microsatellites. So this is an area we could understand more. It seems like they might be pretty homogeneous and connected, but it's a little uncertain. We would need more research. And then we also have the species diversity. Here in Guam, we only have 3 species, so that's not very diverse compared to some areas that might have like 7 species. So that's limiting our resilience a little bit. If we lost Inhalis, there wouldn't really be another big species. Continuous habitat, so if they're reproducing sexually and increasing their genetic diversity, they need to be pretty continuous. You can't have the patches super far apart, otherwise the pollen won't be able to reach the female flowers as well. Do they have energy reserves and a seed bank? So can they rebound after there's a storm or something like that? So that's something we can study more as well. It seems like there's pretty, for our Inhalis, there's pretty good amount of biomass, so they likely have a good amount of energy reserves. That's just from the 2019 LaRoche study we'll talk about in a little bit later. So what is the status of Guam seagrass currently? Overall, Guam has a decline, and that matches what you're seeing in other areas in Micronesia. So this study looked at Palau, a site in Palau and Causeway, as well as some other places in the Indo-Pacific, and it found that there was a general trend of decline in seagrass or changes from those long-lived, slow-growing seagrasses into the shorter, smaller, faster-growing seagrasses. And what was interesting in particular is in Palau, they found a decrease in seagrass, including Inhalis, even though Palau is considered pretty pristine and less impacts, good management. They also found a decline in Inhalus in Cosray at a pristine site in Cosray. So the authors were suggesting that Inhalus might just be kind of susceptible to climate change maybe, which is a little concerning that it's the major species we have here. So that's something to think about and monitor in the future. Is Inhalus just not a very hardy species, kind of like how Acropora is a very sensitive coral species. Overall, in the 6 sites that Inhalus was located, it declined in 4. Looking closer at Guam, we have our seagrass cover in our southern coast. So pretty dense in some areas, the 90 to 100% is the red, right? This was in 2005, by the way, Dave Burdick's Guam Coastal Atlas. So some good seagrass cover here. We have some in Pago Bay, and then a little bit sparser along the eastern coast areas. And this roughly matches what we found from just gathering technical reports from the University of Guam Marine Lab. It's roughly around in the same areas. This photo showed underwater view of some Inhalus around this area, and you can see it looks like it has stuff growing on it. So it's likely that they've had epiphytes growing on them. It's not necessarily like there's been greater epiphytes coverage or something like that. That's pretty normal. One area that might have been impacted is Agate Marina, where this map showed an Inhalus bed in that area, and now this has become a small marina. So there might have been some dredging or something like that. And then looking more closely at LaRoche's 2019 study, which was very helpful. It compared data in a 10-year span from Dave's Coastal Atlas in 2005 to data in 2015. And you can see on this map the percent change during that time frame. And then this graph actually shows the change in the actual area. So it looks like there were some sites that increased a little bit, but if you look at the top 5 sites that had the most area, 4 out of 5 of them decreased, and some of those decreases were pretty large. So let's see what's going on. We'll start with the Ganya East. Here, you can see there was a major decline around 2013, so more seagrass around here, and then 2014 very starkly different, right? And that might have been due to 2013 being a really, really bad year for coral bleaching as well. It was very, very hot, some extreme low tide events. So if you combine those stressors with any other stressors like nutrient pollution in the area, that can just exacerbate the problem and could have caused major seagrass loss. The previous years were also moderate and strong La Nina years, and one study showed that during a La Nina cycle, there was more rain, which put in more nutrients in the water, which then caused seagrass declines. So there's a lot of climate-related factors that might be related to this. Also, this bed was mostly our faster-growing seagrasses, like Haloduli and Holophila, and in the past, Dr. Roy Tsuda found that there was only about 1% seagrass coverage in the area. And then that obviously changed through several decades into this pretty dense cover. So even though this pretty is pretty barren right now, it could potentially grow, and that's happened in the past. Looking a little bit closely at Agate, here's a place called Dottie Beach. You can see also a decline around 2013, and it hasn't made that much of a difference since the most recent image here we have in 2017. So there is also some loss here, although this is showing mostly Inhalus, and a study by the Navy in this area showed that some of the aerial imagery is a little misleading because it doesn't capture the smaller, faster growing seagrasses very well. So there is a little bit more of our faster growing Haloduli down in the south of this particular site. And looking at our southern coast a little more closely, Here is a similar study by Dr. Lori Raimundo, the Menalgis Habitat Focus Area Atlas, where they outlined seagrasses in that particular watershed. So the black lines indicate where they found seagrasses. So it overlaps, and you can see there's some loss, a major loss here, and that matches LaRoche's data as well. The purple represents losses between 2004 and 2015, and then gains are represented in the green. So major loss in Cocos Lagoon, and then it looks like there's a trend of the edges kind of disappearing and growth inwards a little bit, and on this edge some growth. Not really sure why that might be happening. You would think that if it was heat related, then the shallow water very close to shore wouldn't be very good. But again, there's sea level rise, there's other factors like water movement might be a little bit stronger on the edges, differences in the biological community. So lots of different reasons why this could be. If you have any ideas, I'd love to hear them. Looking a little bit closer to that little area next to Cocos Island. So denser seagrass during this time, right? And then loss between 2006 and 2012, and then a huge loss by 2014. These are, once again, our faster growing seagrasses, so they could bounce back, and that seems to have happened before in 1975. This technical report from the Marine Lab showed just a tiny patch of Haloduli here, and now that at some point grew to a large patch, right? So it could just be part of a natural growth and decline cycle. And then for Pago Bay, looking closer there, similar trend where we're losing some of the seagrass on the outer edges, so a little bit of loss there as well. So I've been talking a lot about climate and nutrients and stuff like that, but a really major threat to seagrasses is development. So what are some things that affect development and how much people can develop in the water? Section 404 of the Clean Water Act is a major protector of seagrasses. In this case, they regulate dredging and filling activities. The RHAA affects navigable waterways. So if you do projects in navigable waterways and there's seagrasses in there, then that's going to affect it. Oops, sorry. NEPA requires environmental impact statements for federal projects. And then the fisheries, this Fisheries Act as well designates areas as essential fish habitat, which a large portion of Guam's coastal areas are, and protections for essential fish habitat. And then there's some local protections as well. The fishing regulations in marine preserves, that helps ensure that we have those important biological community members to eat epiphytes and prevent epiphyte overgrowth. And it prevents the removal of seagrasses, although that might not be as much of a threat. We also have the Territorial Seashore Act, which is still being put into place and being kind of hammering out the details with that. So that might affect it out to the, I think it's 60 feet or 60 meter contour line. You'll have to check. I'll have to check on that. And then there's other policies related to core resiliency and fishing that mention seagrasses as well. So what are some of the knowledge gaps and management recommendations? This is kind of just a review of what we've talked about. So we want to better understand what are the drivers in the change in seagrass cover. Is it the climate variation? Is it human impacts? It's probably both, right? Natural climate variation can be stressful, and then climate change is acting upon that even more. Some of it's human impacts, sedimentation, nutrient pollution, right? And those are all going to interact. And you can find that in certain areas, like a study in Florida, they found that seagrasses, when they had two stressors like high salinity with sulfide poisoning, that was too much for the seagrasses. But if they only had one, then they could survive. So it's likely a bunch of these factors impacting the seagrasses at the same time that can cause loss. How is climate change going to affect this? Is Inhalus particularly susceptible? It's a little worrying. if Inhalus is susceptible, we could try to promote more resilient genetic strains of Inhalus, or really drastic, introduce other species at some point if it got really bad. So that's something to just think about for the future and better understand. Are seagrasses being affected by anoxic conditions and sulfide intrusion? That would, if that is true, that could help us know, understand that our local stressors are impacting them a lot and try to address those local stressors. Reproductive resiliency, how much connectivity is there between the beds? Are they able to reproduce enough? Are they connected enough to be able to have the pollen meet the female flowers? Is there seed production? Are there female flowers and male flowers being created? Are there haloidally seed banks? If there aren't seed banks, then that means they might not be as resilient to climate change, or maybe climate change if that increases storms, but especially typhoon events. And then epiphyte ecology and impacts, we just don't really know that much about the epiphytes, the stuff that grows on the seagrass. And there could be a lot of stuff that impacts the seagrass. There could also be seagrass diseases, fungal diseases affect seagrasses in some areas. So that's something we can learn about more as well. And then for the actual recommendations about what we can do, we can support our marine reserves and support other ways to reduce pollution entering the water. So both these things help corals and they're going to help seagrasses as well. We don't want them to limit their photosynthesis and be in these really anoxic conditions and experience sulfide poisoning. So that's one kind of thing we're already working on. And then we can monitor the coverage and density over time. So we could update those coverage maps since 2015 when it was last looked at. And then we can support other research, look at the seed banks, climate change, talk with other researchers. All of that will help us better understand our seagrasses. Oh, and I missed this reproductive output. We want to make sure that they're able to naturally reproduce pretty well. That's pretty basic necessity for them to maintain their populations without us having to intervene. So restoration strategies. We have had loss on average of 22% in our seagrasses in Guam. So restoration is an option to help bring some of those areas back. Overall, there's been mixed success in seagrass restoration. Most of the monitoring has been about a year or a few years maybe, but not very long. And since our seagrasses take a long time to grow, like Inhalus, potentially 10 years, we really need that long-term monitoring to see how well things worked out. There's better success with larger sizes, so there seems to be evidence that there's like a critical mass or something that helps them survive better. It might be all those roots together, putting out oxygen together that helps the overall bed out. This is a little bit challenging for pilot projects, unfortunately, since people recommend thinking in terms of hectares instead of meters, but pilot projects are pretty small usually. And then there's more studies of temperate seagrasses than tropical, so this is an emerging field of research restoration of tropical seagrasses. It's not a reliable mitigation measure, so there should never be instances where development is justified and we're just going to mitigate it and put plant seagrasses somewhere else. That might be a really bad use of time and money and resources. They've tried that in certain cases and the seagrasses don't take, so it's not reliable at all. It's recommended to facilitate and mimic natural recovery. So what that means is kind of look at the ecology and see if you can recreate that. In Florida, they do this modified compressed succession method. Succession meaning this gradual change of species that are good at growing in unstable environments towards species that grow in stable environments, and they make this climax community. It's like the community of organisms and plants that is like the ultimate result after it goes through this process, basically. So in this case, this boat damaged the seagrass bed. The propeller made a propeller scar and it chopped up the seagrasses and removed the sediment. So the first thing they did was fill it up with sediment, stabilize it with some sediment tubes. Then they put in a bird stake, and that is going to invite birds to sit there, and they'll poop into the water and fertilize it. And then if they plant at all, which sometimes they don't, they'll plant the fast-growing pioneer species, and that way they fill in the area pretty quickly. And if they remove the bird stake, they'll naturally just recover into the climax community, the original type of seagrass that was there. As you can see, this can take a really long time though, right? Over 10 years. So here they're trying to mimic what happens in nature with birds and the pioneer species, and just help that along. It's a little less clear if this will work for Guam. Speaking with some of the different people who have experience in our seagrass beds, our haliduli, our fast-growing seagrass, and our inhalus might just prefer different conditions. It isn't necessarily that the haliduli turns into an inhalus over time. It might just be inhalus likes living here, haliduli likes living here. So it might not work. Some manuals have suggested planting haliduli or other fast-growing species before planting inhalus. So it is an option we could try, but not sure if that's really their ecological role. Another option, we can plant adults with seedlings, so plant as polycultures, mixtures of things. If you plant adults by themselves, they seem to do pretty well, high density and medium density. Seedlings don't do as well, and seedlings by themselves don't do very well at all. But seedlings planted with adults do a little bit better. So again, this is an emerging science. Recent study in 2019 showing that planting with adults, maybe it's the greater root structure or oxygen, radial oxygen loss or something like that, that helps the seedlings establish a little bit better. You can also plant species mixed together as well, and that's been seen to increase their success. For the actual transplanting techniques or planting techniques, we have vegetative where we transplant adults, or we have generative where we grow the seedlings. And this is going to be similar to coral restoration, where adults, less time, you don't have to grow them up to a certain size. Adults also have greater survivorship, as you saw in that map in this graph just now. And seeds, they take longer to grow, but they're less destructive to the donor bed. You don't really have to, take a shovel and yank that seagrass out of where it currently is existing perfectly fine. And there's greater genetic diversity, which has been proven to enhance survivorship and growth and all those other good things. We also need more information on seeds. There was a project back in 1977 where they tried to do some seagrass restoration projects. They transplanted adults and they didn't survive very well because they transplanted them too deep. And they tried growing some seedlings and were able to, but they had to import the seedlings from Yap because they were not able to find any female flowers or seeds here. So if you have seen seeds or female flowers, please let me know. Another thing about restoration techniques is if you want to plant with sediment or without sediment. So if you plant with sediment, it avoids having to artificially anchor the plant. It's already anchored in this sediment and it will stay in place a little bit easier. It won't get washed away in the waves, but this can be really hard. You can see that's a lot of sediment. That's like taking that core is not going to be super easy. And Inhalus is one of the largest species with the thickest roots. And so that's going to be really hard to carry, really heavy, and probably a shock to the plant as well. If you plant without sediment, it's easier to transport the seagrass. So it's better for these large species than this method, but you also have to anchor them. So here, metal staple is a pretty common method of anchoring them. There are some other methods. If you don't want to use metal, you can use bamboo skewers, metal racks with biodegradable ties. So here they're tying the seagrass to this metal rack, and eventually the biodegradable tie will break down and then they can remove the metal rack. Mesh bags, so they can weave the seagrass into there. And then once again, mixing adults with or mixing species can help them anchor a little bit better. If you have any ideas, I'd love to hear them. It's kind of like whatever you can finagle. As I mentioned, there was one project in 1977 that had mixed results, so we're still trying to figure this out. They did transplant and put their seedlings into the sediment, but the data is missing on their actual results 1 year later. Looking through the literature, I found 8 other published studies that involve growing inhalus or transplanting them. And there's some manuals that offer advice, but like I said, really new field. We're still figuring things out. Hope to talk with the people that published these studies to learn more from them. And then our best bet might be try a lot of different things and see what works. And then at the same time, address those stressors that we talked about so that any transplants can survive and the currently already healthy adult seagrasses don't die off. So thank you so much for listening. Thank you to the Department of Agriculture, Guam Coastal Management Program, University of Guam, Marine Lab, and Nova Southeastern University for all the support, institutional support in this project. Special thanks to Whitney, my supervisor, Farron Marie, who have helped me explore some of these areas and worked on some specific projects in like outreach, etc. And additional thanks to all these many people who have offered their input already and helped create this collective amount of information that we can share with each other to spur some further discussion about how we conserve our seagrasses. If you have any thoughts, feedback, or questions, I'd love to hear it. We have this community map with a bunch of observations. Most of these are whole technical reports, but if you have seen seagrass flowers, if you have seen a patch that had a weird animal in it that looked like it was dying or anything really, if you have any observations, let me know. I'd love to add it to this map. There's a couple of different working drafts on this literature review. If you want to learn more about ecosystem services, the ecology of seagrasses, legal protections, restoration techniques, let me know. I'm happy to send this to you and get your feedback or just let you read it, whatever you prefer. And then there's some different education outreach initiatives we've been working on. If you want to learn more about those, feel free to contact me as well. And some references. Yeah, so this is my email. Hope to hear from you if you have any questions, and thank you again so much for your time.